The sky had been a gentle, soft blue just an hour ago, the kind of blue that promises a peaceful evening. But on the drive up the winding coastal road toward his solitary house, Colt saw the change begin. It started as a smudge of charcoal on the horizon, a bruise that quickly spread, swallowing the light whole. By the time his sleek, silver car was halfway up the cliffside, the first fat drops of rain began to splatter against the windshield. They were few at first, then multiplied into a frantic, deafening drumbeat. The wind, which had been a gentle whisper, now howled, pushing against the car like an invisible hand trying to stop him from going home. Home. The word felt hollow even as he thought it. The house that waited for him at the top of the cliff was more of a museum than a home. It was all sharp, modern angles and walls of glass, filled with expensive things he'd bought because he could, not because he loved them. Every room was perfectly clean, perfectly quiet. The only sound that usually greeted him was the soft hum of the refrigerator or the distant crash of waves far below. He was a billionaire, a man who could have anything he pointed at, and yet the thing he wanted most, a reason to hurry home, was the one thing his money couldn't buy. He leaned forward, squinting through the windshield wipers that were fighting a losing battle against the downpour. The world outside had dissolved into a blur of grays and greens. This was why he loved this road. It was his barrier, his moat. Nobody came up here unless they had business with him, and tonight he had no business with anyone. He just wanted the silence, as heavy as it was. And then he saw her. A flash of movement in the periphery, a stumble of color against the slick, dark asphalt. He slowed, thinking it was a deer or some other animal caught in the storm. But as his headlight swept over the figure, his breath hitched. It was a woman. She was drenched, her clothes, a simple t-shirt and jeans, plastered to her skin, her hair a dark, wet tangle. She wasn't just walking, she was staggering, one arm wrapped around herself, the other held up as a feeble shield against the lashing rain. She looked like a ghost, a pale, lost thing about to be washed away by the fury of the storm. Every sensible thought in Colt's head told him to drive on. A stranger on his private road in this weather meant trouble. It meant complications he didn't need. But as he drew closer, he saw the raw, desperate exhaustion on her face in the glow of his headlights. He saw the way her shoulders shook, not just from the cold, but from a deep, bone-weary fear. His hand, almost of its own accord, moved to the gear shift, and the car rolled to a gentle stop beside her. The window slid down with a quiet hum, and the roar of the storm filled the car's quiet interior. The smell of wet asphalt and salty sea air rushed in. She flinched, taking a wobbly step back, her eyes wide with a terror that was far greater than any fear of the weather. "Hey!" Colt called out over the wind. "You're going to get struck by lightning out here, or worse. Get in. I'll give you a ride." She just stared at him, her chest heaving. She was shivering so violently he could see it from the car. He could now see the tear in the shoulder of her shirt. The mud caked on her shoes. She looked like she'd been running through the woods, not walking on a road. "Please," he said, and his voice was softer this time, less a command and more a genuine plea. "It's not safe. I have a house just up the road. You can get warm and dry." For a long moment, she remained frozen, a wild animal deciding whether to trust. The rain poured down her face, mixing with what he thought might be tears. Then, with a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, she moved. Her hand fumbled with the door handle, her fingers too cold to work properly. Colt reached across and pushed the door open for her. She collapsed into the leather passenger seat, bringing the storm in with her. Water streamed from her hair and clothes, forming instant puddles on the pristine floor mat. The door thudded shut. And suddenly, the roaring of the storm was muted, replaced by the sound of her ragged, shaky breathing and the drumming of rain on the roof. The car was filled with the scent of wet earth, rain, and her, a faint, clean smell like night-blooming flowers, somehow still present beneath the storm. Colt didn't drive off immediately. He looked at her. She was hugging herself, trying to make herself small, her gaze fixed straight ahead, seeing nothing. He reached behind him into the back seat, where a soft cashmere blanket was neatly folded. He held it out to her. "Here," he said. She looked at the blanket, then at his hand, then finally met his eyes. Her eyes were the color of the sea during a storm, a deep, troubled greenish gray. In that one look, he saw a universe of pain and fear. She took the blanket with trembling hands, her fingers brushing against his for a split second. The touch was ice cold, but it sent a jolt of something warm and entirely unexpected straight through him. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, pulling it tight, hiding herself within its folds. Only then did Colt put the car back into drive. They continued up the mountain road, the silence between them thick and heavy, filled with unspoken questions. He had no idea who she was, where she came from, or what kind of trouble she was in. All he knew was that the empty silence of his house suddenly didn't seem so appealing anymore, and the lonely night ahead had just become infinitely more complicated. The moat around his castle had been crossed, and he was the one who had opened the gate. The car's engine purred to a stop in the vast, echoing space of the garage. The sudden silence was a physical thing, broken only by the frantic drumming of rain on the roof high above and the ragged, shaky breaths coming from the passenger seat. Colt turned off the ignition, and the interior lights came on, casting a soft, intimate glow that felt too bright, too revealing. He glanced at the woman beside him. She had not moved, except to pull the cashmere blanket more tightly around her small frame, as if she could disappear into its soft folds. Her knuckles were white where she clutched the fabric. She was staring straight ahead at the concrete wall, but he could tell she wasn't seeing it. Her gaze was turned inward, fixed on some private horror he couldn't begin to imagine. "Come on," he said, his voice unnaturally loud in the quiet car. "Let's get you inside." He stepped out, the sound of his car door closing echoing like a gunshot in the cavernous garage. He walked around the front of the car, his shoes making soft, wet sounds on the polished concrete. He opened her door, and she flinched at the movement, a tiny, instinctive recoil that spoke volumes about her state of mind. She unfolded herself from the seat slowly, stiffly, as if every movement caused her pain. The blanket, now heavy with water, slipped from one shoulder, and he saw again how her thin shirt was torn, revealing a long, angry scratch on her skin beneath. She was still shivering, a constant, tremulous vibration that seemed to come from her very core. He didn't offer a hand, sensing she would not take it. Instead, he simply led the way to the door that opened into the main house. He pressed his thumb to a sleek black panel, and a lock clicked open with a smooth, technological sound. The door swung inward, and he stepped aside to let her pass. The transition was jarring. They moved from the cold, damp, industrial feel of the garage into the overwhelming warmth and silence of his home. The air inside was still and dry, scented faintly of lemon wood polish and something else, something clean and empty. The entryway was vast, with a floor of polished dark wood that reflected the recessed lighting from above. A single, monumental piece of abstract art hung on one wall, a swirl of dark colors that cost more than most people's houses. It was breathtaking and utterly lifeless. She stopped just a few steps inside, her wet shoes leaving dark, shameful marks on the perfect floor. She seemed to shrink under the high ceiling, a small, drenched, and wounded bird that had flown into a cathedral. Her eyes, those stormy, sea-colored eyes, darted around, taking in the stark modernity, the clear absence of any personal touch. No family photos, no messy piles of mail, no lived-in comfort. It was the house of a man who slept somewhere, not a man who lived there. Her expression, already fearful, tightened with a new kind of anxiety. This was not a cozy, safe cottage. This was a fortress. "Wait here," Colt said, his voice softer now, trying to navigate the strange new territory of having another person in his space. "I'll get you something." He moved away, his own footsteps silent on the thick area rug in the living room. He went to a large linen closet, its door blending seamlessly into the wall, and pulled out a towel. It was a thick, plush, snow-white towel, the kind found in expensive hotels. He brought it back to her. She was still standing in the exact same spot, as if afraid to move and contaminate the space further. "Here," he said, holding it out. She looked at the towel as if she didn't quite know what it was. Then, slowly, she reached out a trembling hand and took it. She didn't use it immediately. She just held its soft, dry weight in her hands, a stark contrast to everything about her that was wet and cold. "You must be freezing," he said, feeling a profound awkwardness. He was used to giving orders, to negotiating multi-million-dollar deals, but he had no script for this. "I can make you some tea, or hot chocolate. Something warm to drink." She didn't answer, but she gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. He turned and walked towards the open-plan kitchen, a landscape of gleaming stainless steel and dark granite. He filled a kettle with water, the sound impossibly loud in the silence. He could feel her presence behind him, a pocket of stormy energy in his sterile world. He set the kettle on its induction hob and turned to find her still standing there, clutching the towel, the blanket still draped over her shoulders like a sodden cape. "You can sit down," he said, gesturing towards a large, low-slung sofa in the living area. It was a piece of art, all sharp angles and pale gray fabric, and it looked about as comfortable as a park bench. He'd never actually spent much time sitting on it. Hesitantly, she took a few steps forward and perched on the very edge of the sofa, her body tense, ready to flee. She finally lifted the towel and began to pat it carefully against her face and hair. The movements slow and exhausted. She was trying to be careful, to not make a mess, and the sight of it, this desperate attempt at politeness in the midst of her obvious distress, tugged at something deep inside him, something he hadn't felt in a very long time. The kettle whistled, a shrill sound that made her jump. He poured the boiling water into 2 mugs, dropping a tea bag into one and stirring powdered cocoa into the other. He carried them over and set them on the low glass table in front of her. "I wasn't sure which you'd prefer," he said, sitting down in a chair opposite her, leaving a careful, respectful distance between them. She looked at the 2 steaming mugs. Her eyes lingered on the hot chocolate. Slowly she reached for it, her cold-wrapped fingers curling around the warm ceramic. She brought it to her lips and took a small, cautious sip. A tiny, shuddering sigh escaped her, a puff of steam from her lips. It was the first sign of relief she had shown. They sat in silence for a long while, the only sounds the muffled rain against the panoramic windows and the soft clink of her mug when she set it down. He didn't press her. He just drank his tea and watched as the heat from the drink seemed to slowly, infinitesimally, loosen the tight knot of fear in her shoulders. The color began to return to her pale cheeks. Finally she spoke, her voice a hoarse whisper, rough from disuse or from crying. "Thank you," she said. The words were so quiet he almost missed them. "My name is Scarlett." "Colt," he replied, giving his own name like a gift in return. She nodded, her eyes meeting his for a fleeting second before dropping back to her mug. I don't have anywhere to go," she whispered, the confession seeming to cost her a great effort. "I can't go back." He looked at her, this woman named Scarlett, who had fallen from the storm into his sterile life. He saw the scratch on her shoulder, the terror in her eyes, the proud way she was trying to hold herself together even as she was falling apart. The sensible part of his brain, the part that had built a billion-dollar empire on cold, hard logic, screamed at him that this was a problem, a liability, a risk he should not take. But looking at her, sitting small and lost on his expensive sofa, all he could feel was a protective urge so strong it surprised him. His big, empty house had never felt so much like a shelter until this moment, when there was someone in it who actually needed one. "You can stay here tonight," he heard himself say, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "There's a guest room. It has its own bathroom. You'll be safe here. No one will find you." She looked up at him then, her stormy eyes wide, searching his face for any hint of a lie, any trace of the danger she was so clearly running from. Whatever she saw in his gaze, not pity, but a solid, unwavering certainty, seemed to convince her. The last bit of tension drained from her posture, leaving only a profound, bone-deep weariness. "Okay," she breathed, the word a surrender. "Thank you." And in that moment, the house was no longer just a collection of expensive things. It had a purpose. It was a harbor. And Colt, the lonely billionaire at the top of the cliff, was now a keeper. The silence after their agreement felt different now. It was no longer an empty space to be filled, but a fragile, understanding quiet. Colt watched as Scarlett finished the last of her hot chocolate, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she were relearning how to be safe. The shivering had subsided into an occasional tremor, like the last echoes of a terrible quake. He knew the conversation was over for now. The deep, dark things that had brought her here would have to wait for the light of day, when the storm outside, and the one inside her, had passed. "Let me show you where you can sleep," he said, his voice low, careful not to shatter the delicate peace. He rose from his chair, and she followed suit, unfolding herself from the sofa with a soft, weary sigh. She kept the white towel draped over her shoulders, a flag of surrender and acceptance. He led her away from the vast openness of the living area, down a wide hallway where the lighting was softer, recessed into the floor, illuminating the way without being harsh. The hallway was lined with more of those sleek, frameless doors, but he stopped at one near the end. He pushed it open, revealing a room that was, like the rest of the house, impeccably decorated and utterly impersonal. It was a guest suite, designed by an interior decorator to be a perfect picture of modern luxury. There was a large bed with a gray upholstered headboard, crisp white sheets, and a single abstract painting on the wall in shades of silver and blue. A door on the far wall stood slightly ajar, revealing the cool gleam of a marble bathroom. "It's not very cozy," Colt said, a hint of apology in his tone. He gestured toward the bathroom. "There are fresh towels in there. Everything you need should be stocked. The shower has hot water." The words felt stupid and practical, but he didn't know what else to offer. Scarlett just nodded, her eyes taking in the room without really seeing it. She was operating on a basic animal level now, the need for warmth, for cleanliness, for the simple feeling of being dry. "Thank you," she whispered again, the phrase becoming her only currency. I'll find you something to wear," he said, suddenly realizing her clothes were ruined. "I'll leave it outside the door." He withdrew, pulling the door closed behind him with a soft, definitive click. Alone in the hallway, he let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The scent of rain and night-blooming flowers still lingered in the air around him. He went to his own room, a master suite that felt more like a high-end hotel room than a personal sanctuary, and rummaged through his drawers. He found a soft, gray cotton t-shirt, one of the few items he owned that wasn't tailored or ostentatious. It was simple, clean, and would swallow her whole. It was the most comforting thing he could think to give her. He walked back down the hall, his footsteps silent on the plush runner. He could hear the faint, muffled sound of the shower running from behind her door. The image flashed in his mind unbidden. Scarlet standing under the spray, the grime and fear of the day washing away, the hot water soothing her cold, bruised skin. He pushed the thought away, feeling like an intruder. He carefully placed the folded t-shirt on the floor just outside her door, a small white flag of his own. He tapped twice on the wood, a quiet signal that something was there, and then retreated to the living room, giving her all the space in the world. Back in the guest room, Scarlet stood under the torrent of near-scalding water, her eyes closed. It was the first time she had felt truly warm in what seemed like days. The steam filled the large glass-enclosed shower, clouding the world outside, creating a temporary cocoon where the past couldn't reach her. She washed her hair with the expensive citrus-scented shampoo, scrubbed at the dirt on her skin until it was pink, and let the water pound the tension from her muscles. For these few minutes, there was no running, no fear, just the simple, primal pleasure of heat and cleanliness. When she finally turned off the water, the silence of the house rushed back in, but it felt different now, protective. She stepped out onto the cool marble floor, grabbing one of the thick, oversized towels from a warmed rack. She dried herself vigorously, the rough texture of the towel feeling real and grounding. Wrapping it securely around her body, she pushed open the bathroom door, letting a cloud of steam billow out into the cooler bedroom. And then she froze. The bedroom was empty, just as she had left it. But on the floor, just inside the main door, was the folded gray t-shirt. A wave of gratitude washed over her. He had thought of this small, essential detail. She padded across the room, her bare feet silent on the rug, and bent to pick it up. As her fingers closed around the soft fabric, the towel wrapped tightly around her chest suddenly loosened its grip and, with a soft, whispery sound, slid down her body and pooled in a damp heap at her feet. She was standing there, completely naked, the cool air raising goosebumps on her skin, one hand still clutching the t-shirt, when she heard a soft knock at the door. It happened in a heartbeat. The door, not fully latched, swung inward a few inches. Colt had returned. A thought had struck him, a toothbrush, a basic necessity she wouldn't have. He'd retrieved a new one from a supply closet and came back, his intention to simply leave it with the shirt. The knock was a courtesy, but the slight push was enough. His eyes met hers across the dimly lit room. She was illuminated by the soft glow from the bathroom, a silhouette of pale skin and dark, wet hair. He saw the elegant curve of her back, the delicate line of her shoulders, the way her body seemed both fragile and strong in the half-light. The air left his lungs. His mind, usually a whirlwind of calculations and strategies, went utterly, completely blank. It was filled with nothing but the shocking, beautiful image of her. Scarlet gasped, a tiny, strangled sound. She didn't scream. She didn't scramble to cover herself. For a frozen second, she was just a deer in the headlights, her stormy eyes wide with a new kind of shock, one layered with vulnerability and a strange, undeniable charge. Then, instinct took over. She whispered the words, so soft they were almost just a breath, a statement of pure, undeniable fact. "I'm naked." The sound of her voice, husky and laced with shock, broke the spell. Colt's gaze snapped up from her body to her face. What he saw there, a profound, heart-stopping vulnerability, hit him harder than any sight of her skin. He felt a jolt, a raw, primal heat that flashed through him, so intense it was almost dizzying. It was a feeling so powerful it nearly stole his reason, his control, his very mind. His own face flushed with a heat he hadn't felt since he was a boy. He jerked his head away, his heart hammering against his ribs like a wild thing. I'm sorry," he stammered, the words thick and clumsy. The shirt. I brought a—" He couldn't even form the sentence. He simply reached a hand in, blindly placed the toothbrush on the floor next to the door, and pulled the door shut with a firm, definitive click that echoed in the sudden, pounding silence of the hallway. He stood there for a long moment, his forehead pressed against the cool wood of the door, trying to catch his breath. The image of her was burned onto the back of his eyelids. The curve of her hip, the line of her neck, the startling honesty in her whispered confession. It was the most intimate, unplanned, and electrifying moment of his life. The sterile, controlled order of his world had not just been crossed. It had been utterly shattered by a single, whispered truth, and he was the one left, reeling in the aftermath. The solid wood of the door felt cool and unyielding against Colt's forehead. Behind it was a silence so profound it seemed to hum with its own energy, a stark contrast to the roaring in his own ears. His heart was a frantic, heavy drum against his ribs, a rhythm of pure, unvarnished shock. The image of Scarlett, pale and graceful in the dim light, was seared into his mind with the blinding clarity of a lightning strike. It was more than just the sight of her. It was the stunning vulnerability, the raw, unguarded truth of her whisper. "I'm naked." The words echoed in the silent hallway, each repetition sending another jolt of that strange, dizzying heat through his veins. He, a man who commanded boardrooms and dictated terms, had been utterly unraveled by 3 whispered syllables. He pushed himself away from the door, his movements stiff, like a machine whose gears had been jammed. He retreated down the hall, not toward his own bedroom, but back to the vast, dark living room. He needed space. He needed the familiar, cold geometry of his own domain to ground him. He stood before the wall of windows, but he didn't see the storm-lashed night outside. He saw only the reflection of the room behind him, and superimposed over it, the ghost of her, the curve of her shoulder, the dark fall of her wet hair, the wide, startled pools of her eyes. A restless energy gripped him, a physical ache that made him clench his fists. He had spent years building walls around himself, brick by emotional brick, and she had, in a single, unplanned moment, found a crack and blown them all apart. Back in the guest room, Scarlett stood frozen for a full minute after the door clicked shut. The air in the room felt charged, different. She could still feel the weight of his gaze on her skin, a tingling trail that followed the line of her spine, a hot flush, entirely separate from the shower's heat, spread from her chest up her neck to her cheeks. It wasn't entirely embarrassment. Woven through the shock was a thread of something else, something warmer and more dangerous, a thrilling, terrifying awareness. For so long, she had been trying to be invisible, to fold herself into the background. In that moment, she had been seen, truly seen. And the man who had seen her hadn't looked at her with greed or menace, but with a stunned, reverent awe that had left him as shaken as she was. Her hands trembled as she finally pulled the soft gray t-shirt over her head. It swallowed her, the fabric smelling faintly of him, a clean, masculine scent of soap and cedar and something uniquely Colt. It was like being wrapped in a ghost of his presence. She crawled into the large, cold bed, pulling the crisp duvet up to her chin. The sheets were cool and smooth against her skin, a stark contrast to the memory of his heated gaze. She lay there in the dark, listening to the dying whimpers of the storm outside and the frantic beating of her own heart inside. The fear that had been her constant companion for weeks was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but now it was tangled up with this new, bewildering feeling. She felt safe in his fortress, and yet, for the first time, she also felt perilously, undeniably alive. The night passed in a fitful haze for both of them. Colt did not sleep. He paced the length of his house, a caged predator in a gilded cage. Every time he closed his eyes, she was there. He replayed the moment again and again, each time the heat flaring anew, each time the protective urge rising up to meet it in a confusing, powerful clash. He was a man of action, of control, and this was chaos, a beautiful, whispering chaos. When the first gray light of dawn finally began to bleed into the sky, tinting the retreating clouds with shades of rose and gold, Colt was already in the kitchen, making coffee. The routine was automatic, but his mind was elsewhere. He heard the soft creak of a floorboard behind him and turned. Scarlett stood at the entrance to the living room, silhouetted by the morning light. She was still wearing his t-shirt, which fell to her mid-thigh, and her bare legs looked pale and slender. Her hair was damp again, brushed and falling in soft waves around her shoulders. She looked young and clean, and so heartbreakingly tentative that it made his chest tighten. "Good morning," she said, her voice still husky from sleep, but clearer than it had been the night before. "Morning," he managed, his own voice rough. He gestured to the coffee maker. "Coffee? Please." She hovered, uncertain, until he poured a mug and handed it to her. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, a simple, accidental touch, but it sent a spark, a tiny echo of the previous night's current, through them both. She looked down into her mug, a faint pink returning to her cheeks. They took their coffee out to the large balcony that overlooked the ocean. The storm had washed the world clean. The air was sharp and fresh, and the sea below was a churning, brilliant blue, still agitated from the night's tantrum. They stood side by side at the railing, not speaking, watching the sun climb higher. The awkwardness was still there, a living thing between them, but it was now mixed with a strange, quiet understanding. "It's beautiful," Scarlett said softly, her eyes on the horizon. "It is," Colt agreed, but he wasn't looking at the view. He was looking at the way the morning sun caught the gold highlights in her hair, at the way she held the warm mug between her hands as if drawing strength from it. She took a deep, shaky breath, as if gathering courage. She kept her gaze fixed on the ocean, on the vast, endless expanse of freedom it represented. "His name is David," she began, her voice so quiet he had to lean in slightly to hear. "My ex, it started small, questions about where I was, who I was with, then it was anger, throwing things. The first time he grabbed me, I told myself it was a mistake, that he was just stressed." She swallowed hard. "But it got worse. He said if I ever left, he'd find me. He'd make me sorry. Last night, he found me at a friend's house. I had to climb out a back window and just run. I didn't know where I was going. I just ran until I couldn't run anymore." Colt listened, his jaw tightening. A cold, hard fury began to burn in his gut, a clean, sharp emotion so different from the confusing heat of before. He didn't interrupt. He just let her talk, let the poisoned story spill out into the clean morning air. When she finally fell silent, tears tracing silent paths down her cheeks, he turned to face her fully. He reached out, his movement slow and deliberate, and gently wiped a tear away with his thumb. The touch was electric, a point of searing contact. "Look at me, Scarlett," he said, his voice low and firm, leaving no room for doubt. She lifted her watery sea-storm eyes to his. "He will never touch you again," Colt said, each word a vow hammered out of steel and conviction. "He will never find you here. You are safe. I will make sure of it." In that moment, he wasn't just a billionaire in a glass house. He was a fortress, a shield, a promise. And as Scarlett looked into his eyes, seeing the unwavering certainty there, she felt the last of her defenses, the walls she had built around her own heart, begin to crumble. The space between them was no longer filled with just awkwardness or fear, but with a new, terrifying, and beautiful possibility. The storm had passed, and in its wake, something had been born in the quiet space between their shared silence. The vow hung in the salt-tinged air between them, a tangible thing, solid as the railing they leaned against. In the wake of her confession, a profound shift had occurred. The air, once thick with unspoken fear and the ghost of their shocking encounter, now seemed clearer, lighter. The truth, however ugly, had been laid bare, and in its place grew a fragile, burgeoning trust. The days that followed settled into a new, strange rhythm within the glass house on the cliff. Colt, who was used to his life being a series of scheduled appointments and decisive actions, found his world had shrunk to the spaces he and Scarlett shared. He worked from his home office, his video calls with executives in far-off cities feeling surreal and distant, his attention perpetually divided, a part of him always listening for the soft sound of her footsteps in the hall. Scarlett, meanwhile, began to unfurl like a flower long deprived of sun. The deep, paralyzing fear that had gripped her began to loosen its hold, replaced by a cautious, dawning sense of security. She started to leave the guest room for more than just meals. She would wander into the living room and gaze at the abstract art, no longer seeing a cold, expensive object, but a puzzle of color and shape. She discovered the library, a room Colt rarely entered, and pulled books from the shelves, losing herself in other worlds, safe in the knowledge that this one, for now, was protecting her. She started to cook, simple meals at first, filling the sterile kitchen with the warm, comforting smells of garlic and herbs, a domestic alchemy that transformed the house in a way no decorator ever could. Colt would find her there, humming softly to herself, and the sight would strike him with a force that was becoming familiar, a deep, unsettling, and wonderful ache. It was on the 5th day that the gilded cage of Colt's world attempted to reclaim him. A formal charity gala, an event he had committed to months ago and had entirely forgotten, loomed on his calendar. His assistant called, a flurry of anxious reminders about tuxedos and speech notes. The thought of putting on a stiff tuxedo and making hollow conversation in a crowded, noisy ballroom felt like a kind of torture. But then, a different thought, a dangerous and thrilling one, occurred to him. He found Scarlett curled on the sofa in the library, a book open in her lap. The afternoon sun streamed in, catching the red and gold highlights in her brown hair. "I have to go to a thing tonight," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "A party. For charity." She looked up, her expression neutral, but he saw a flicker of something in her eyes, not fear, but a slight withdrawal. "Oh, okay." He took a step into the room. "I don't want to go alone." He paused, letting the words settle. "I'd like you to come with me." Her eyes widened. "Colt, I can't. My clothes and all those people." The old panic threatened to resurface. "I'll take care of everything," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "No one will know you. We'll be together." The last 3 words were not a plea, but a promise. Together. A few hours later, a personal shopper from an exclusive boutique arrived at the house, her arms laden with garment bags. Scarlett watched, bewildered, as dresses of silk, chiffon, and velvet were laid out before her. Colt stood back, letting her choose. Her fingers finally brushed against a floor-length gown of a deep, vibrant crimson. It was the color of courage, of blood, of a heart laid bare. "This one," she whispered. When she emerged from her room later that evening, Colt felt the air leave his lungs for the second time since he'd met her. The red dress clung to her every curve, elegant and fierce. It contrasted stunningly with her pale skin and dark hair, which was swept up in a soft, loose style that made him want to reach out and pull it all down. She looked not like a scared runaway, but like a queen. Her stormy eyes were wide with a mixture of terror and excitement. "You look," he began, but words failed him. He simply offered her his arm. The gala was a whirlwind of light, music, and glittering chatter. Colt kept her close, his hand a constant warm pressure on the small of her back, a silent anchor in the swirling sea of strangers. People looked at them, of course. They were a striking pair, the powerful, enigmatic billionaire and the breathtaking, unknown woman in red. Whispers followed them, But Colt seemed oblivious. His entire focus was on her. He introduced her simply as Scarlet and deflected any prying questions with a cool, practiced ease. Then the music slowed. A soft, romantic melody filled the grand ballroom. Colt turned to her, his eyes asking a silent question. She gave a tiny, nervous nod. He led her onto the dance floor, taking her into his arms as if it were the most natural thing in the world. For Scarlet, the rest of the world melted away. The watching eyes, the murmuring voices, the crystal chandeliers, it all blurred into a distant haze. There was only the solid feel of his shoulder beneath her hand, the warmth of his palm against her back. The clean, masculine scent of him, and the steady, reassuring rhythm of his heart. He held her closer than was strictly necessary for a waltz. His head dipped, his lips close to her ear. "No one has ever looked at me the way you do," he murmured, his voice a low vibration she felt through her entire body. "They see my money, my name. You just see me." She lifted her gaze to his, and the raw honesty she saw there made her breath catch. The air between them crackled, charged with all the unspoken things, all the stolen glances and accidental touches of the past days. The protective shield, the fierce promise, was now mingled with a deep, undeniable wanting. He was looking at her mouth. He was going to kiss her. Here, in front of everyone, he was going to bridge the last small distance between them and claim her lips with his own. And in that perfect suspended moment, the old fears, trained into her by months of terror, reared their head. A public display, all these eyes. What if someone saw? What if David? The thought was a splash of ice water. Her body, which had been melting into his, went rigid. A flicker of pure panic crossed her face, and she subtly, instinctively, turned her head a fraction of an inch, breaking the spell. The almost kiss died before it was born. Colt felt the rejection like a physical blow. The warmth in his eyes cooled, replaced by a shuddered, confused hurt. He didn't pull away, but the intimate connection was severed. He finished the dance with perfect, polite formality, his face a carefully neutral mask. When the music ended, he simply said, "I think I should take you home." The ride back to the cliffside house was shrouded in a heavy, painful silence. The beautiful connection they had woven throughout the evening had been torn, and neither of them knew how to mend it. The red dress, once a symbol of courage, now felt like a costume, and the memory of the dance, of his lips so close to hers, hung between them, a beautiful, ruined thing. The silence in the car on the drive back to the cliff was a thick, suffocating fog. It was a living entity that filled the space between them, heavy with wounded pride and the sharp sting of rejection. Colt's hands were tight on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He stared straight ahead at the dark road, his profile a hard, unreadable mask in the dashboard's glow. The warmth, the connection, the whispered intimacy of the dance floor felt like a cruel joke from a different lifetime. All he could feel was the cold slap of her turning away. He had laid himself bare. He had been ready to cross that final line in front of God and everyone. And she had flinched. The billionaire, used to getting what he wanted, had wanted her, and for a blinding moment, he had felt the sting of not being wanted back. Scarlet sat curled against the passenger door, as far from him as the space would allow. The beautiful red dress now felt like a trap, the fabric scratching against her skin, a mocking reminder of her own cowardice. She could still feel the ghost of his hand on her back, the warmth of his breath near her lips. She hadn't meant to reject him. It was the world, the eyes, the terrifying possibility of exposure. But how could she explain that when the hurt was radiating from him in almost visible waves? She had seen the light in his eyes extinguish, replaced by a cold, distant politeness that was far worse than anger. She had broken something fragile and new, and she was terrified it was beyond repair. The house, which had begun to feel like a sanctuary, was now just a cold, empty structure again when they entered. The grand, open spaces seemed to echo with their unsaid words. Without a word, Colt headed straight for his study, a room she had never entered, and closed the door with a soft, final click. The sound was a punctuation mark on the evening, on whatever had been growing between them. Scarlett changed out of the dress, hanging it carefully in the closet, as if putting away a relic from a forgotten life. She put on the now familiar soft gray t-shirt, but tonight it brought no comfort. It only smelled like him, a reminder of what she might have lost. She crawled into the large bed, but sleep was impossible. The memory of the almost kiss played on a loop in her mind, each time ending with the flinch, the hurt in his eyes, the crushing weight of her own fear. She had traded a prison of terror for a gilded cage, and now she had managed to lock herself away from the one person who made her feel safe within it. Hours later, she fell into a fitful, troubled sleep. But her mind, a treacherous landscape, offered no escape. She was back in the dark, running, her breath tearing from her lungs. This time, it wasn't just David chasing her. The faces in the crowd from the gala were there, their smiles twisting into sneers, pointing, laughing. And then Colt was there, but he was turning away from her, his back receding into the distance, his name a silent scream on her lips. She was alone, completely and utterly alone in the crushing dark. A sound tore from her throat, a choked, terrified whimper that escalated into a full-blown, heart-wrenching sob. She bolted upright in the bed, gasping, her body drenched in a cold sweat, the echoes of her own fear still ringing in the silent room. The door to her bedroom opened a moment later. Colt stood there, silhouetted by the dim hall light. He was still wearing his trousers from the tuxedo, his shirt untucked and unbuttoned at the top, his hair disheveled. He hadn't been sleeping either. The cold mask was gone, replaced by a raw, open concern. "Scarlett?" he said, his voice rough with sleep and worry. She couldn't speak. The sobs racked her body, great, heaving tremors that stole her breath. She was ashamed, embarrassed, and so scared of being left alone with the monsters in her head. He didn't hesitate. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and sat on the edge of the bed. He didn't try to hold her immediately, didn't offer empty words. He simply sat there, a solid, warm presence in the dark. "It was a dream," he murmured, his voice a low, steady anchor. "Just a dream. You're safe." His voice, the sheer certainty of it, broke the last of her control. A fresh wave of tears came, and this time she leaned into him, her forehead pressing against his arm. The contact was electric. It was permission. Colt's arms came around her then, strong and sure. He gathered her against his chest, her sobs muffled by his shirt. He could feel the frantic, rabbit-like beat of her heart against his own. He held her, one hand cradling the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her soft hair, the other making slow, soothing circles on her back. The hurt and confusion from earlier evaporated, burned away by the fierce, overwhelming need to protect her, to banish the shadows from her mind. "Shh," he whispered into her hair, his lips brushing against her temple. "I've got you. I'm here. Nothing is going to hurt you." Slowly, the violent sobs subsided into shaky, hitching breaths. She didn't pull away. She melted into him, her body fitting against his as if it were designed to be there. The fear that had gripped her began to recede, not because the nightmares weren't real, but because his presence was more real. The solid wall of his chest, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the protective circle of his arms, it was a stronger truth than any her fear could tell. He held her like that for a long, long time, until her breathing evened out, and the tension left her body. He gently lowered them both back onto the pillows, never letting go, her head nestled in the crook of his arm. He pulled the duvet up over them both, creating a warm, dark cocoon where the outside world and its dangers could not reach. Lying there in the dark, with her curled trustingly against him, Colt felt a shift more profound than any on the dance floor. This was not about passion or possession. This was about something deeper, something fundamental. Her flinch hadn't been a rejection of him. It had been the ghost of her past, a reflex she couldn't control. And holding her now, feeling her finally find peace in his arms, felt like a greater victory than any kiss could ever have been. The misunderstanding began to dissolve in the shared, quiet darkness, replaced by a deeper, more profound understanding. The broken thing between them wasn't beyond repair. It was, in fact, in the very process of being mended, forged anew in the quiet aftermath of a shared nightmare. The night bled slowly into a soft, gray dawn. Colt had not slept, not in any true sense. He had remained perfectly still, acutely aware of the weight of Scarlett's head on his arm, the gentle puff of her breath against his chest, the way her fingers had slowly unclenched from his shirt to rest, open and trusting, on his heart. The frantic, terrified creature from the depths of her nightmare had been soothed back into a peaceful slumber, and he had been the one to guide her there. This knowledge settled in him, a warm, solid weight, more satisfying than any business acquisition had ever been. The hurt and confusion from the gala had been washed away, replaced by a clarity so sharp it was almost painful. He understood her now, not as a project or a damsel in distress, but as a whole person, fractured by fear, but fiercely strong in her will to survive. When the first true rays of sun began to paint the room in hues of gold, Scarlett stirred. She woke not with a start, but slowly, languidly, swimming up from the deepest, most restful sleep she had known in years. Consciousness returned not with the usual clutch of anxiety, but with a sense of profound safety and warmth. Then she became aware of the source of that warmth. Colt. She was curled against him, her body molded to his side, his arm a heavy, protective band around her. The memory of the night flooded back, the nightmare, his sudden presence, the way he had held her until the demons retreated. She felt no embarrassment, only a deep, resonating gratitude. She tilted her head back just enough to look at him. His eyes were open, watching her. There was no trace of the cold, shuttered mask from the night before. His gaze was clear, warm, and filled with a quiet intensity that made her breath catch. "You stayed," she whispered, her voice husky with sleep. "I said I would," he replied, his voice a low rumble she felt through his chest. The air in the room changed. The space between them, which had been a sanctuary of comfort, now began to crackle with a different kind of energy. The memory of the almost kiss at the gala hung between them, but it was no longer a source of tension. It was an unfinished sentence, and the quiet intimacy of the morning was begging for its conclusion. Colt's hand, which had been resting on her back, moved slowly, his fingers tracing a faint, lazy pattern along her spine through the thin cotton of the t-shirt. It was the lightest of touches, but it sent a shower of sparks across her skin. Her eyes fluttered closed for a second, a soft sigh escaping her lips. "Scarlett," he murmured, her name a prayer on his lips. She opened her eyes, and the look they shared was a conversation in itself. It was an apology for the flinch, an acknowledgement of the fear, and a declaration of a trust that had been forged in the dark of the night. It was a question and an answer. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he began to shift them. He rolled onto his side, facing her fully, his head propped on one hand. The duvet pooled around their waists. The morning light illuminated the sharp planes of his face and the deep, quiet longing in his eyes. His free hand came up, his fingers gently brushing a stray strand of hair from her cheek, then cupping her jaw. His thumb stroked the soft skin just below her ear. This was different from the dance floor. There were no watching eyes, no ghosts of the past crowding in. There was only the two of them, in the quiet of the morning, in a bed that had become a world unto itself. The fear was gone, burned away by the certainty of his touch. Scarlett's heart was beating a wild, joyful rhythm, but it was not the rhythm of panic. It was the rhythm of anticipation, of want. She lifted her own hand, her fingers trembling only slightly as they came to rest against his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. It was her answer. Colt leaned in, his movement achingly slow, a question in the diminishing space between them. She met him halfway. The first touch of his lips on hers was not a conquest, but a homecoming. It was soft, a whisper, a gentle exploration. It was sweetness and heat and a promise all at once. It was the sealing of a vow made in a storm, tested in a ballroom, and solidified in the aftermath of a nightmare. Her lips were softer than he had ever imagined, and they yielded to his with a trust that shattered the last of his own defenses. The kiss deepened, not with frantic urgency, but with a profound, building intensity. It was as if they were learning each other, tasting the truth of one another. His hand slid from her jaw into her hair, angling her head to better fit his mouth to hers. Her fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt, holding on as the world tilted on its axis. There was no past, no future, only this perfect, endless present. It was a kiss that held all the words they hadn't known how to say, the "I'm sorry," the "I understand," and the most important one, the one that had been growing since he'd stopped his car in the rain. "I'm yours." When they finally broke apart, breathless and dazed, their foreheads rested together. Their breaths mingled in the small space between them. Scarlett's eyes were wide, her lips slightly swollen, and in their stormy depths, Colt saw no trace of fear. He saw only wonder and a reflection of the overwhelming love he felt blooming in his own heart. He didn't need to ask if it was okay. He didn't need to say anything at all. The first kiss had been a question, and the second one, as he leaned in to capture her lips again, this time with more confidence, more heat, was the beautiful, definitive answer. The morning sun streamed into the room, bathing them in light, as the last of the walls between them crumbled into dust, leaving only the truth of what they had found in each other's arms. The first kiss was a key turning in a lock, opening a door to a world that had only existed in hints and stolen glances. In the days that followed, the glass house on the cliff was transformed. It was no longer a sterile showcase or a temporary shelter. It became a universe of two. The air itself seemed different, charged with a new, gentle energy, humming with the soft sounds of shared laughter and the quiet comfort of silences that were no longer awkward, but deeply intimate. The space that had once echoed with loneliness now held the warm, living proof of their connection. Colt found that his work, once the central pillar of his existence, had been gracefully demoted. The urgent pings from his phone, the stacks of contracts awaiting his signature, all of it faded into background noise against the simple, profound pleasure of watching Scarlett. He watched her as she stood on the balcony, her face turned to the sun, a small, peaceful smile playing on her lips. Lips he now knew the taste of. He watched the way she bit her tongue in concentration while trying a new recipe in his kitchen, filling the cold, polished space with the warm, comforting scent of baking bread and simmering sauces. He learned that she hummed when she was happy, a soft, tuneless melody that was now the soundtrack to his life. Their conversations unfurled, moving from the dark history of her past to the bright, silly details of the present. She told him about her love for art, not the abstract, expensive kind on his walls, but the messy, vibrant kind found in street markets and sunlit studios. He told her about building his first company from a dusty garage, not the billion-dollar empire it became, but the struggle, the thrill of the first sale, the taste of cheap coffee and ambition. They were sharing the blueprints of their souls, piece by fragile piece, and the touches. The touches became a new language they were both fluent in. It was no longer just about the deep, breathless kisses that could stop time, though there were plenty of those, stolen in the hallway, shared slowly on the sofa as the evening drew in. It was about the everyday poetry of contact. It was his hand finding the small of her back as he passed her in the kitchen, a silent, "I'm here." It was her fingers gently brushing through his hair as he sat reading, her touch easing away the lingering tension of a business call. It was the way they would sit together on the large sofa, her legs curled under her head resting on his shoulder, his arm around her, their bodies fitting together in a way that felt both new and as ancient as the tides below the cliff. This new intimacy was a slow, sweet burn. It was the discovery of the sensitive spot just behind her ear that made her sigh. It was the way his breath would hitch when she traced the line of his jaw with her fingertips. They learned each other's landscapes in the quiet of the bedroom, the morning sun or the silver moonlight their only witness. There was no rush, no frantic urgency, only a profound exploration. It was in the way he would undress her, not with haste, but with a reverence that made her feel cherished, each inch of revealed skin a treasure. It was in the way she would learn the hard, powerful planes of his body, her touch both shy and confident, mapping the territory of the man who had become her sanctuary. Their lovemaking was a conversation without words, a language of sighs, whispered names, and trembling touches. It was the ultimate act of trust, her allowing him to see her, all of her, not just in body but in the raw, unfiltered emotion that shone in her eyes. And for Colt, it was the final surrender of a heart he had kept locked away for so long. In her arms, he wasn't a billionaire or a CEO, he was just a man, desperately, completely in love. The powerful, controlled man learned the joy of losing control, of being vulnerable, of finding his home in the arms of a woman who had seen him at his most shaken and had chosen to stay. One evening, they were tangled together in his large bed, the sheets a soft wreckage around them. The last of the sunset was a fiery streak on the horizon, casting the room in a deep, orange glow. Scarlett was lying with her head on his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart, her fingers idly tracing circles on his skin. Colt had one arm wrapped around her, holding her close, his other hand gently stroking her bare arm. "I used to hate the quiet in this house," he said, his voice a low vibration under her ear. "Now it's my favorite sound, because it's not quiet anymore. It's filled with you." She lifted her head, propping her chin on his chest to look at him. Her hair was a dark, messy cascade over her shoulders, and her eyes were soft and full of a love so deep it made his throat tight. "What does it sound like to you?" she asked. He thought for a moment, his gaze drifting over her face, memorizing her. "It sounds like peace," he whispered. "It sounds like coming home." He leaned down and kissed her, a slow, deep, lingering kiss that held all the promises of the future. In that moment, surrounded by the fading light and the certainty of each other, the big, empty house had never felt so full. The loneliness that had clung to Colt for years had been vanquished, not by money or power, but by the gentle, unwavering love of the woman he had found in the rain. They had found their way past the encounter, through the fear, and into the quiet, burning heart of an intimacy that felt for the first time for both of them, like forever. The peace they had built was a beautiful, delicate thing, a crystal castle constructed day by loving day. For weeks, it felt unshakable. The world outside, with its dangers and demands, had receded into a distant, unimportant hum. Colt's security system, a silent, sophisticated network of cameras and sensors that encircled the property, was a detail he barely thought about, a precaution that had become as routine as locking a door. It was the digital moat around their real-life paradise. Scarlett, wrapped in the safety of his arms and his world, had almost let herself believe the past was truly behind her. The fear had softened, becoming a faded photograph rather than a living nightmare. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Colt was in his home office, finishing a video conference. Scarlett was in the library, curled up with a book, a cup of tea cooling beside her. The sun was streaming through the windows, painting warm rectangles of light on the floor. It was a perfect, quiet moment. Then, a sharp, insistent chime cut through the silence, followed by the pulsing of a red light on the panel by the front door. The house's serene atmosphere shattered. Colt's head snapped up from his monitor. His security chief's voice, tight and urgent, came through the intercom. "Mr. Colt, we have a perimeter breach, the east gate, an individual on foot, matching the description you provided." Scarlett heard the chime from the library, and the sound was a spike of pure ice driven straight into her heart. She knew. She didn't need to be told. The book slid from her numb fingers, thudding to the floor. The piece shattered like glass. Colt was already moving, his face a mask of cold, hard fury. He strode into the library, his phone to his ear, barking orders to his security team and the local police. His eyes found Scarlett, who was standing frozen, her face ashen, her hands trembling violently. The terror was back in her eyes, a wild, feral thing that hollowed him out. "He's here," she whispered, the words barely audible. Colt crossed the room in 3 strides and took her by the shoulders. His touch was firm, grounding. "Look at me," he commanded, his voice low and absolute. "He will not set foot in this house. He will not touch you. Do you understand me?" Before she could answer, a figure appeared outside the large library window. A man, his face contorted with a possessive, ugly rage. David. He was pounding on the reinforced glass, his mouth moving, shouting words they couldn't hear but could easily imagine. Threats, promises. The monster from her past was no longer a ghost. He was here, smearing his hatred against their sanctuary. Scarlett let out a small, terrified cry and stumbled back, but Colt didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the man. His entire focus was on her. He moved his body, placing himself squarely between her and the window, his back to the raging spectacle outside. He was a human shield, his gaze locked on hers, refusing to let the horror outside become her reality. "He is nothing," Colt said, his voice unwavering. "He is a ghost, and I am going to make him disappear." Just then, the distant wail of sirens cut through the air, growing rapidly louder. The sound of pounding fists was replaced by shouts and scuffles as Colt's security team and the arriving police officers swarmed the property. They subdued David, pulling him away from the window, his furious screams fading as he was dragged from their sight. Colt didn't move. He kept his body between Scarlett and the window until the commotion outside had completely ceased. Only when the head of his security team gave him a sharp nod from the doorway, signaling the situation was contained, did he finally relax his stance. Scarlett was shaking, tears of relief and residual fear streaming down her face. Colt pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. He could feel the frantic beat of her heart slowly begin to steady against his own. "It's over," he murmured into her hair, his voice now soft. The steel replaced by a profound tenderness. "It's really over, Scarlett. He's gone." She clung to him, her fingers digging into his back, not out of fear, but out of a desperate, grateful need to anchor herself to the man who had just proven his vow was not just words. He had stood between her and her nightmare, a solid, unyielding wall of protection. He hadn't just offered her a safe house, he had been her fortress. Later, when the police had taken their statements and the property was once again secure, they stood together on the balcony. The sun was setting, painting the sky in the same fiery colors as it had on so many peaceful evenings. The danger was past. The legal wheels were in motion. David would be facing serious charges, his threat permanently neutralized. Scarlett looked out at the horizon, but this time, She didn't see an escape route. She saw her future. She turned to Colt, her eyes clear for the first time since he'd found her on that rainy road. The last shadow of fear was gone, burned away by the ferocity of his protection. "You were my shield," she said softly. Colt took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "I will always be your shield," he replied. "But you, Scarlet, you are my peace." The external threat was gone. The last chain of her past had been broken. They stood together, hand in hand, on the other side of the storm, stronger for having faced it, and ready, at last, for the forever that awaited them. The final, lingering ghost of the past had been banished. With David's arrest, a silence fell over the cliffside house that was deeper and more profound than any that had come before. This was not the empty silence of loneliness, but the rich, full quiet of a battle won, of a peace hard-earned and permanent. The air itself seemed to sigh in relief, the constant, low-grade hum of anxiety that had followed Scarlet for months evaporating completely, leaving behind a clarity so pure it was like seeing the world for the first time. She was free, not just safe within the walls of Colt's fortress, but truly, utterly free to build a life, to step out into the sun without looking over her shoulder. The world, once a landscape of threats, was now a canvas of limitless possibility. In the weeks that followed, the house continued its transformation, but now it was a transformation of purpose. It was no longer just a lover's sanctuary. It was a home being built, brick by emotional brick. Scarlet's art books now sat openly on the coffee table. Her favorite blanket was perpetually draped over the back of the sofa. The kitchen, once a showroom, now held a jar of wildflowers she had picked from the garden, their imperfect, vibrant beauty a quiet rebellion against the sterile perfection. Colt, in turn, found his own stern, minimalist tastes softening. He didn't just tolerate the changes, he cherished them. Every new, small sign of her presence was a treasure, a mark that she was putting down roots, that she was staying. Their love, tested by fear and solidified by protection, settled into a deep, unwavering certainty. It was in the easy way they moved around each other, a silent, intimate dance perfected over time. It was in the way they could communicate with a single look across a room, a look that could convey amusement, desire, or unwavering support. The passionate, discovery-filled intimacy of their early days matured into a profound connection that was both a roaring fire and a steady, warming glow. It was the knowledge that they were each other's first thought in the morning and the last before sleep, two separate souls now irrevocably woven into a single, stronger tapestry. One evening, as the sun began its majestic descent into the Pacific, painting the sky in a breathtaking spectacle of orange, purple, and gold, Colt led Scarlet out to their favorite spot on the cliff's edge. The air was warm and still, carrying the salty scent of the sea and the sweet perfume of the night-blooming jasmine that now grew in pots by the door. Below them, the waves crashed against the rocks in a rhythmic, eternal song. It was a scene of perfect, breathtaking beauty. But for Colt, the true beauty was standing beside him, her hand warm in his. He turned to her, his heart beating a rhythm that was both frantic and perfectly calm. This was the moment. Everything in his life, all the success, the struggle, the lonely years, had been a winding path leading directly to her. He reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around the small velvet box. "Scarlet," he began, his voice low and thick with emotion. He dropped to one knee, looking up at her as the dying sun set her hair ablaze with light. Her eyes widened, her free hand flying to her mouth, her breath catching in a soft, shocked gasp. "This house," he said, his gaze never leaving hers, "was just a structure of glass and steel before you. It was empty. I was empty. You fell into my life from a storm, and you brought the sun with you." You taught me that the strongest walls aren't made of money or concrete, but of trust and love and the courage to be vulnerable. He opened the box, revealing a simple, elegant diamond that caught the last of the sunset's fire, sparkling with a clean, brilliant light. You are my peace, my home, my everything. Will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Will you stay with me and build this forever with me? Tears streamed down Scarlett's face, but they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. She wasn't the scared, running girl anymore. She was a woman, standing strong in the love of her man, ready to face a future she had never dared to dream of. There was no hesitation, not a single second. Yes, she breathed, the word a joyful sob. Yes, Colt. 1,000 times, yes. He slid the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, a symbol of a promise made and kept. He rose to his feet and swept her into his arms, spinning her around as her laughter, the most beautiful sound he had ever heard, mingled with the crash of the waves. He kissed her then, a kiss that was a seal on their past, a celebration of their present, and a vow for their future. It was a kiss filled with all the passion of their first and all the deep, abiding love of their 1,000th. As the stars began to pepper the velvety night sky, they stood wrapped in each other's arms, the engaged couple, looking out at the endless ocean. The lonely billionaire and the woman he found in the rain had found their way to each other, through fear and intimacy, to this moment. Their story was one of a protective love that became a healing love, a sanctuary that became a home, and an encounter that became a forever. Their journey began with a whisper in the storm, but it doesn't have to end here. If you've been swept away by Colt and Scarlett's story, there are countless other tales of love, courage, and forever waiting to be discovered. To find your next favorite romance, to lose yourself in another world where hearts find their way home, make sure to subscribe. Your next unforgettable adventure in love is just a click away.